Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. Thank you for being here. The esoteric history of Detroit may, in fact, be one of the most interesting narratives we've been presented with so far. Today, we will look at 70 of the oldest photographs of Detroit, dated from 1860 through 1898. Detroit was known in the 19th century as the Paris of the West for its immense architecture and urban layout. And Detroit was one of the first cities electrified by Thomas Edison, beginning on Washington Boulevard. Detroit was also home to some of the earliest and tallest skyscrapers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, what if I were to tell you that Detroit, like so many other cities in America, was founded by the Mound Builders, was once full of epic and sprawling indigenous earthworks, and the first European structure on this land was a star fort? Detroit, according to the current narrative, was occupied as early as 11,000 years ago by Paleo-indigenous people who created hearths and numerous still visible geological features. The largest impact on Detroit, however, was made by the Mound Builders, who were said to have left behind dozens of massive mounds, earthworks, earthen forts, and other transformations of the landscape. We're told the largest mound discovered by European settlers in Detroit existed along the River Rouge and was known simply as the Great Mound. However, it is now theorized that most of the land beneath and surrounding Fort Wayne, which is a star fort, was actually part of a much larger earthwork that contained the sites now known as the Copperworks Mound, the Central Mound, the Fort Wayne Mound, the Springwells Earthwork, and most of the Sand Hill itself. In this theory, those mounds are the pinnacle of a much larger earthwork that goes much deeper into the ground than was previously believed. If that wasn't interesting enough, we have discussed before how the Iroquois often appeared to be working in tandem with European settlers. In Detroit, we have a similar narrative. By the year 1700, the Mound Builders were long gone. However, we do have settlements of the Huron and Ottawa peoples, just to name a few. Then, roughly around the time the French began to venture towards the land that would become Detroit, we also have the Western nations of the Iroquois League pushing their way into Detroit. We're told that around the year 1650, the French were at war with the Iroquois and didn't dare work their way deeper inland. So the French never reached Detroit up until that point. However, by the 1680s and the 1690s, we're told the Iroquois apparently had taken over Detroit and expelled every other indigenous group from their settlements there. Then we're told around the year 1670, French missionaries became the first Europeans to reach the land that would become Detroit. And here, in 1670, it is written these missionaries discovered a huge stone statue that was venerated by the indigenous people. The narrative does not say which group this statue belonged to or what it depicted, but we are told the French destroyed this idol with an axe, and then they planted 12 trees on the exact site that would become known as Waterworks Park, which is by far the greatest water supply architecture that I have seen from the 19th century. But I digress. So the French discover Detroit. It's marked by a massive stone statue, an indigenous statue, which is destroyed and replaced with trees on the exact part of Detroit that would contain the city's most complex and old world looking architecture. What a coincidence. But wait, the history gets even stranger. We're told Detroit was developed as a refugee city for displaced indigenous people by the explorer Cadillac in 1698. The French crown took 3 years to approve Cadillac's plan, and in 1701, Cadillac set off with 100 Frenchmen, I assume architects and warriors, to conquer Detroit and build the first star fort in that area that would become known as Fort Detroit. What makes this story even more questionable is we're told nearly as soon as Cadillac had permission to conquer the landscape of Detroit, an investigation was launched by French authorities into his actions, and it was proven that Cadillac was conducting business in ways that were detrimental to the French crown. So Cadillac was removed from developing Detroit and sent to New Orleans as punishment. That's according to the current narrative. So Cadillac envisioned this land, which was known to house indigenous people who were complex enough to have carved large stone statues, and he proposed building them a fortification to protect them from being displaced. France then approves this plan, but once Detroit is entered, it's basically empty, it's abandoned, as the Iroquois, we're told, have driven off all the other indigenous people from the land of Detroit prior to the French arrival. So the land is easily conquered, and instead of allowing Cadillac to stay and benefit the indigenous cause, there really isn't an indigenous cause in Detroit because the indigenous people aren't there anymore. So the French decide to punish Cadillac for wanting to help people. They remove him from Detroit and they construct their fort, but as a trading hub, allowing only Europeans to walk freely within its palisaded walls. That's all according to the current narrative, and we're told Detroit was the largest French settlement between New Orleans and Montreal, and it prospered as one of the largest fur trade hubs in recorded history, garnering unfathomable new riches for the French crown. However, we're told by the mid-1700s, not only did the indigenous often attack the fort, as in the Fox Wars, but the British had also become increasingly familiar with the area and sought to capture Fort Detroit. Fort Detroit was surrendered to the British control in 1760. However, very quickly the indigenous of the area grew weary of the British and their trade tactics, which culminated in Pontiac's Rebellion, which saw numerous unrelated indigenous tribes and nations band together in an effort to overthrow the British government in America. In the end, Pontiac's Rebellion captured or destroyed numerous significant forts, store forts, but failed to capture what was considered the most important fort of them all, Fort Detroit. The narrative continues by telling us that one of the main goals of the Revolutionary War was to gain control of Detroit. That's also something I've never read anywhere else before. However, we're told at this time, America lacked frontiersmen and an understanding of how to penetrate into the Detroit region. It wasn't until the 1783 Treaty of Paris that Detroit was officially ceded to the United States. However, we're also told British forces remained in control of all trade in Fort Detroit until 1796, as federal forces were apparently unable to remove the British from the Star Fort. The Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1795 saw General Anthony Wayne negotiate the indigenous alliance against further support of the British, and this culminated in the 1796 Jay Treaty, which completely removed all British control and influence from Detroit. Detroit then grew rapidly under the leadership of Father Gabriel Richard, who founded the school that would become the University of Michigan. He built numerous indigenous American schools in Detroit. He established the project to build the first major road connecting Chicago and Detroit, and he founded the first printing press in Michigan, which led to the founding of Michigan's first newspaper. However, the Great Detroit Fire of June 1805 was said to have destroyed all of the original city, with all that remained, according to the narrative, being red brick chimneys and one warehouse along the river, with the rest of the city being reduced to rubble. Detroit's flag and motto reflect this tragedy, with the motto actually being, and I quote, "We hope for better things, it will rise from the ashes," end quote. Detroit was first incorporated as a town of the Northwest Territory, and this occurred in 1802. Just 19 days after the Great Fire that cleansed all of the structures in Detroit, Congress established the Michigan Territory as a separate territory of its own, with Detroit named as the capital. Now, at that time, Detroit was ran by territorial judges who in 1806 convinced Congress to approve massive funding for the development of Detroit. When you see the original plan of Detroit, you can certainly see a lot of symbolism in the design. I'll let you be the judge of that though. We're told Detroit was designed much in the same way as Washington, D.C., so again, the symbolism you see is really profound. Detroit was officially recognized as a city on September 13, 1806. We're told Detroit was pretty easily captured during the War of 1812 by British forces, who surrounded the city with a massive conglomerate of indigenous warriors led by Tecumseh. The governor of Detroit, by the name of Hull, was actually convicted of treason for his cowardice, but was saved by a presidential pardon. What makes this another strange piece of Detroit history is we are told once the British captured the city, they didn't stay. They didn't occupy the Star Fort. They didn't try to impose their trade monopoly on the region again. They simply captured, destroyed, and left. We're told American forces then easily recaptured the abandoned city in 1813 and used the Star Fort as a base to launch attacks into Canada to permanently end the threat of raids by the British and the indigenous people. We're told one man, Lewis Cass, was the saving grace of Detroit, who reset the city's standards and rebuilt trust. If you've watched my video on the Paysor family who controlled much of the South, allegedly, before the Civil War, you'll know that one of the key breadcrumbs in that is the understanding of the life of Lewis Cass Paysor. I'm not saying these two individuals are related at all, but it's very interesting, the similarity in the names and the narratives. We're also told, and this is most likely true in many cities in America, but Detroit had an ample slave population who most likely built the original city, but all records of slave ownership, just like most of the true history of Detroit, was destroyed with the Great Fire of 1805. We're also told it is believed most of the slaves in Detroit, at least in the earliest days, were of indigenous American backgrounds and taken from the land upon arrival. Detroit was said to have rebuilt very quickly following the Great Fire, and by the onset of the Civil War, 1861, over 45,000 people called Detroit home. We're told Detroit was a key stop on the Underground Railroad, but did also face backlash nationally for the 1863 riots, which saw Irish and German Catholics resisting the mandatory draft laws enacted for the Civil War. Many African and indigenous American homes and businesses were attacked. We're told following the Civil War, Detroit grew to be a hub of worldwide trade, and many factories appeared on the shores of Detroit, as Detroit was a key link among the Great Lakes global trade system. We're told by the end of the 19th century, Detroit was the cast iron capital of the world and produced more cast iron stoves than any city in the world, which gained Detroit the moniker, the stove capital of the world. The city flourished during the late industrial age, and Detroit is said to be filled with Victorian-style mansions. Many have survived, as well as apartments, churches, and other lavish pieces of Victorian-style architecture. However, we're also told that there's always been a much darker side to Detroit's history. For example, in the year 1889, it is noted that of the over 150 unique streets that were said to have existed in Detroit at this time, only roughly about 5 of them were paved. And that is where we get to the end of this narrative, because I wanted to cover today just the 19th century, where we see a massive gentrification period of Detroit that begins in the 1890s, and it comes to an apex with the founding of Ford's car company in the early 1900s. From there, Detroit becomes a business capital full of steel skyscrapers and other architecture we are not as interested in today. So that is why I wanted to cover the history of Detroit. As soon as I started diving into this narrative, there was so many different things that stood out to me. One, this was a mound builder city. It was a city full of mounds and earthworks, so much so that even on the outskirts of the city, we still know of at least 5 or 6 of these earthworks that still exist in one way or another, or at least were so well documented that we have a lot of information that remains about them. And yet, full excavations never really took place, and the history is still very much up in the air. We do not know a lot about the mound builders, but we know that this area was sacred to them. And then we have other indigenous groups that would also come to call the landscape of Detroit home, and this area was also sacred to them. So much so that we have mysterious stone statues, or at least one mysterious stone statue that was founded here by French missionaries. Now, diving into that further, when the French finally mustered up the manpower to come and conquer Detroit, when they arrived, there were no indigenous people left. And then the narrative goes on to explain that by saying that the Iroquois had wiped out or pushed away all the other indigenous groups that called Detroit home, and the Iroquois themselves had also abandoned the area. So when the French arrived, and again, they arrived under the auspices of creating a fort to help the indigenous people, and yet that is never what happened. Cadillac and his plan were removed, and the history just doesn't really add up. There's so many questions here, more questions than we have answers. And the more you dive into it, the more you begin to see patterns in the history, not just in Detroit, but in many of the greatest cities in America. So that is what we are looking at today. The oldest photographs of Detroit, the mound builder city, the great industrial city. What was really happening here in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries? I'll let you decide. I would love to hear your thoughts and ideas in the comment section down below, and we will talk again very soon on the next video.